Welcome today's webinar, Rethinking Comprehension. I'm Dr. Barb Smith, Chief Development Officer here at American Reading Company, and I am beyond excited as a former teacher and reading administrator to spend the next hour with all of you and with our guests, Dr. Hugh Catts and Dr. Sonya Cabell from Florida State University. As we get started today, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. I'm honestly such a fan of their work. I'm not quite sure what to say or not say. So I think let's hear from them right away. Hugh?
Hi, I'm Hugh Catts, and as Barbara said, I'm from Florida State University. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Science and Disorders. I'm also affiliated with Florida Center for Reading Research. And one of the areas I'm interested in is comprehension. Early in my career, one of my primary interests was dyslexia. I have a family history of dyslexia. I have a brother who's dyslexic. When I was in the early school grades, I had quite a bit of trouble with reading. And that kind of led me to doing research, particularly in early identification of dyslexia, with the desire to provide services to prevent the severity of the reading problems and to decrease the number of negative consequences that come along with being a poor reader. But in that work, we did a number of longitudinal studies, and the kids got older, and we turned to look at comprehension. And initially, I saw comprehension like many of you probably do, and most of the field in general. But in that work, it led me to have a different perspective about reading comprehension that changed pretty dramatically over the last 10 years or so. And I've been talking about that, writing about that, and I'll share some of those ideas with you here today. But I'm joined by my colleague, Sonia, who is also from Florida State. And it was one of the things I was really excited about was having her on the faculty. We know each other from probably 15, 20 years ago when I gave a talk at University of Virginia. But Sonia does some of the best work related to content-rich literacy instruction, not just in the research that she does that has been testing programs, but also in the reviewing of the literature with the meta-analyses that she and colleagues have done. I think is really helping us recognize the importance of teaching comprehension. And let's put it this way: what goes into comprehension within the context of a curriculum, so forth. So, Sonia, if you want to introduce the rest of yourself.
Well, thank you so much. That's really kind of you, Hugh. I'm Sonya Cabell. I'm an associate professor in the School of Teacher Education and in the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University. I used to be a second grade teacher, and I was a reading coach in the days of Reading First. So in the early 2000s, we're going to be talking a little bit about the 5 pillars that came out of the National Reading Panel report. And I lived that as a reading coach, that Reading First time. I really became interested in comprehension because of language. We've had difficulty improving the language learning environments for children, for young children, for preschoolers, for kindergartners, in ways that affect their reading comprehension. And so the way I became interested in content-rich instruction was really the evidence that I was seeing around content as being a potentially facilitative way, a way to facilitate conversations that had richer language. And that's why I became interested in this integrated kind of content and literacy approaches. But I want to share, and I'm excited to talk to you about that today. And I want to share something though about Hugh that I hope won't be embarrassing to him, or I kind of hope it will. I want to share that in 2005, when I started my first year of graduate work at the University of Virginia, we used your book, Language and Reading Disabilities, Catts and Kami. I think it was the second edition back then. And I was so thrilled to meet Hugh.
Oh.
I'm shocked that he remembered who I was. I was so thrilled to meet him when I was in grad school, because he's a giant in the field. And when you think about language and how language underlies reading difficulties, he is a giant and legendary. So I almost, wanted him to sign my book at some point. I didn't go that far. But when I full circle moment for me in 2016, when I interviewed for my position at Florida State, Hugh pulled me into his office and said to me, before I gave my job talk, he said to me, "You're studying the exact right thing at the exact right time." And think of what kind of a boost of confidence that gave me to hear that from him. So thank you, Hugh. I'm thrilled to be on this call with you.
Yeah, and that was a truth too. It wasn't trying to boost your confidence so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. The interesting thing is you've kind of turned back to that language or refocus, because you have a new book on
Yeah.
conversations that I got a chance to look at the pre-print view of that.
Thank you. Yes. Strive for 5 Conversations. It'll be out with Scholastic. My colleague Trisha Zucker and I. So my line of research focuses on developing and preventing reading difficulties by laying a foundation for children in their terms of their language. And it's really the content for me comes in because of language.
Wow. I so appreciate the generosity with which both of you approach giving your time to us today, and in talking about each other. And Hugh, that wasn't embarrassing at all. I thought for sure it was going to end with "she had it signed." Yeah. And I'm going to go back and look and see. I believe I had that on my shelf too, because Sonia, you and I were reading First Technical Assistance in the same time period too, right?
Yeah, I don't particularly look at myself as a star. I mean, I look at myself that's really lucky that I came into the field at a time when there was some really low-hanging fruit, and maybe I took it a little bit in the right direction. But I appreciate people thinking that.
Well, and I appreciate your humbleness. And you know what? We've been talking here a little bit down memory lane, and we've already referenced a couple different huge initiatives in the United States. Comprehension was identified by the National Reading Panel more than 20 years ago, as one of the 5 pillars of reading instruction. And we, ironically, are looking at that as a hot topic today. While a lot of clarity has been gained in areas like phonics, there seems still to be a lot of mystery around comprehension. And Hugh, I'm wondering if you could unpack that for us, especially with just your background. You've lived it all.
Yeah, I mean, the point that I came to recognize in the last study that I was doing related to comprehension, it was the Reading for Understanding project, which was a project funded by IES, Institute of Education Sciences, to try to move quickly to understand how to improve reading comprehension. So there was a lot of money put out front for groups to write proposals for, and so forth, to get the funding to do that. And I was fortunate enough to be a member of one of the teams that was part of that. And it had a really ambitious goal that we were going to do this in 5 years. And I learned probably about halfway through of it that we really were misunderstanding the nature of comprehension, and our idea that we were going to make noticeable large gains and gains that might be instructional relevant, that could be put into place quickly, all right, was really misguided. That comprehension is not one of the components of reading. I mean, I think that the reading panel, that graphics that's come out of there, has been useful in some ways, and but it kind of it's misled people in other ways. Right. So let me give you a little history of that. The National Reading Panel was convened back in the late 1990s when the Congress commissioned the National Institute of Health and Department of Education to bring together a group of researchers to look at the work that's been done in reading, particularly reading as it related to instruction. And so they broke the team up into groups, and really, I think like 3 groups initially, and one group was concerned with alphabetics, another group concerned with fluency, and another group with comprehension. But in the process of writing the report, they had a number of chapters there, and they broke alphabetics down into phonological awareness and phonics, and they broke comprehension down into vocabulary and text comprehension. But then again, it gets reduced down to comprehension, and that was translated, I guess, for the field as the big 5, or the 5 pillars of reading. And it in some ways, it's an unfortunate representation of comprehension by having it within that group of with the other 4, and especially the graphics that are done with it. So the graphic is, we'll get the big 5, and they're done top to bottom with in boxes, and comprehension is a little tiny box at the top. And in the pillars, they're all the same size, right? And we're affected by the visual images we see. And seeing those images gives us the impression that comprehension is comparable to those other components of language in terms of its complexity and its malleability. Now, we know that's not the case, right? But it lends itself for us to think in that way. It also lends itself to lead us to instructional practices like in an ELA time of the day, working on phonological awareness, phonics, and then turning to and working on comprehension for the next 45 minutes to an hour. This is done in part because this the graphic, the comparison to the other components, has led us to believe that comprehension is a set of skills, right? Kind of like what's involved in swimming. I use that example in an article that I have in the American Educator, but swimming's a skill. It's complex initially, but once you learn how to do it, you can swim in a lake, an ocean, the pool, whatever it might be. But reading comprehension is not like that. It's not the case that you can learn a set of skills and then go apply that to any particular text you read. Right? You'll see it as we talk about it. There are skilled components to reading that can be directly taught, but much of reading comes from experience, broader educational life experiences. And while phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency are kind of contrived, constrained is what I want. So
You can edit that out, Hugh.
constrained, they can be acquired in a fairly short period of time. But vocabulary, which really should be included with comprehension, comprehension's acquired over the lifetime, right? That comprehension is the most complex thing that you and I do on a regular basis, and we should be thinking about it in a very different way than we think about those other skills. They can be taught together, so I'm not going to completely separate them, but if we wanted a graphic, we'd have the little 3 and the big 2. The big 2 would be vocabulary and comprehension into a single construct. And I think that's kind of related to what we're talking about today, because the reason it's so big is comprehension is so dependent on what you already know about the topic that you're reading about, listening about, so forth. Right? That the comprehension is is as a thing, if you will, is the result of the reader combining what they already know about the text with what's in the text to form a new understanding of the particular topic. And I think that may lead to our discussion of knowledge, but
Yeah. So if you know a little something, it's easier to learn more.
yeah.
And what I hear you also saying is I might do really well at identifying the main idea in certain circumstances, or I might be able to summarize in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
But what background knowledge I have and general knowledge I have to bring to that really matters, as well as what I'm gaining from the text and really even what I do with the text. Sonia, do you want to top off anything Hugh said? I mean, I know that some of the answer to this, or the thinking around this, is that we've underestimated the role knowledge plays. But
Yes.
I want to give you carte blanche to go where you want to go.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as a, reading first coach and a reading first teacher in the academies in 2 different states during that time, we talked about those 5 pillars and treated them like they were each distinct from one another and not related to one another into a larger whole. So teachers at that point in time didn't get that kind of a larger framework for how reading develops and the underlying skills needed. When I think about, that vocabulary and comprehension piece, like Hugh was saying, being that kind of a larger piece, I also think about oral language just underlying everything, because oral language connects not only to the comprehension pieces, but also to the decoding pieces. In a recent report from the Shanker Institute by Susan Newman and colleagues, what they did was they reviewed the legislation in the 50 states around the dyslexia initiatives and found that the legislation was primarily defined by these 5 pillars outlined in the National Reading Panel report. And something interesting that they found was that oral language and background knowledge, while it was in there some of the time, really was largely missing from the legislation. And so I think about those pieces, those critical pieces to comprehension that are missing from comprehension recommendations. So I think that this really having a more complete understanding of how reading develops is important, so that we can lay the foundation for children in ways that will help their understanding, and think about how both language and knowledge and all of these skills build from the very beginning.
Sonia, I can't distill this down to one powerful point because, I'm hanging on every word, but you referenced that recent, came out in July, I believe, Shanker Report. And we have a lot of school administrators here, people who are looking at curriculum, making decisions. That report, it was really designed in the face of, there's a lot of reading legislation right now. So they really looked across all of it, and there was good news. But one of the pushes was in this area of how we think about reading it, and again, you've talked about it, pinpointed oral language, building knowledge, but also writing. So we're not underemphasizing phonics here or phonemic awareness. Those are important skills, but they're necessary but not sufficient to become that lifelong reader and knowledge worker and so on. So I really appreciate you mentioned that, because I think administrators could easily just take that handout, take Hugh's article. They're really digestible for book studies and work sessions back in your school districts. Could we dive a little deeper around knowledge and comprehension? Why are you optimistic, as we've been talking about content-rich language arts instruction and knowledge building curriculum as perhaps a way into improving where we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to understand how well somebody comprehends a passage after they read it, you need to know what they knew about it before they read it, right? That that there's a number of studies that show that knowledge trumps ability, right? Trumps general language ability, general reading ability. The famous study about baseball, where they had poor readers that knew something about baseball, they actually gave better answers. They were more often correct and questions about it than skilled readers who did well in general tests of reading comprehension. Right? And there's just no question about the role of knowledge in comprehension. And what knowledge does for you is it gives you an initial start at understanding a text you might read. It provides an organization for you. It gives you a place to put information in as it comes in. We can better remember information that we already know something about. That somebody once used a description that knowledge is like mental Velcro, that it sticks better if you have that particular knowledge. What often gets talked about in the role of knowledge is inferencing, right? That writers seldom include in their text everything you need to know to understand that particular text. The purpose of reading, or the purpose of writing as an author, is to provide new information, not old information. So authors make a judgment about what their readers are likely to know and don't include a good deal of that information, knowing that their readers will infer that as they read a text. Well, the problem is, if you're a reader who doesn't have a background in the particular area of that text, you're not going to be able to make an inference. Not even if you've been taught a strategy of inferencing. Inferencing strategy will not work if you don't have anything to infer. So knowledge is particularly critical there. I'll talk a little bit later, but the inferencing strategy, I mean, it's a good thing to do, but it's not going to do you much good unless you have knowledge. And the other thing about inference is interesting is most of them are highly automatic. They happen just like that. As a reader, you put that information into a representation that includes all that stuff that the author didn't include, right? So you automatically know that information. But other inferences take a bit more work, right? Causal inferences, or where you've got to infer something at the end of the text or the beginning of the text. And that's where strategies related to inferencing can help kids be more active in their trying to use their past experience.
I appreciate that thinking around strategies. That helps make it really real. Sonia, I'm wondering, from your perspective, you're looking at a lot of curriculums right now and looking at language arts content instruction. Why are you optimistic about content-rich language arts instruction, right, and knowledge-building curriculums? What, as a way to address some of this?
So when I think about content-rich English language arts curricula, I think about how this approach has really kind of taken hold since about 2010, and the advent of the Common Core State Standards that talked about knowledge building in English language arts. And curricula were beginning to be developed that integrated science and social studies systematically into English language arts. And so when you take a step back from that, however, I want to talk a little bit more broadly about integrating content-rich instruction and literacy, regardless of if it's English language arts or science and social studies instruction, or you're doing it across the day. And my colleagues, Heijin Huang and I did a meta-analysis that Hugh had mentioned earlier, where we looked at across all the studies that were experiments or quasi-experiments in kindergarten through 5th grade that integrated content knowledge and literacy, whether it was in English language arts or whether it was other times of the day. And these were not all studies that were using published materials. A lot of the studies were materials that researchers had created and were testing. And there were moderate to large effects on both vocabulary and comprehension, including more generalized, standardized comprehension. And there was also an effect on content knowledge as well. This, told us that there is something about integrating content and literacy that gives purchase for vocabulary and comprehension than traditional siloed approaches. Now, I think that this will be fun to kind of hear us, Hugh and I, talk about this, because I'm interested in hear what he has to say about this. But when you just zoom into content-rich English language arts approaches, there are several widely used content-rich ELA curricula on the market. Knowledge Matters campaign highlights some of those. And there is some evidence about these curricula that's very positive. For example, I have studied core knowledge language arts in kindergarten and in first grade. And there was also a study on American Reading Company's ARC core kindergarten program. And both of these showed positive effects on children's learning. Specifically in our CKLA study, we found an impact on vocabulary and on content knowledge. And specifically in terms of vocabulary, the impact was also on not only on the words that they learned, but also on the generalized expressive vocabulary. And I think more convincingly are the longitudinal studies that are coming out that show that sustained content-rich literacy instruction over time can help children's comprehension in the long term. One of those studies is also on the core knowledge approach. It's not on core knowledge language arts per se, but it's on the core knowledge sequence. Dave Grissomer and his colleagues studied the core knowledge sequence in charter schools in over several years in elementary school and found positive effects on on comprehension. James Kim, or Jimmy Kim's work from Harvard University, has longitudinal effects on his MORE intervention, model of reading engagement, that if students receive instruction in first grade and in second grade, they have longitudinal impact on third grade reading comprehension outcomes. So I find this to be a compelling space. I don't necessarily think the final answer is with content-rich English language arts approaches, where content is infused into English language arts, but rather I think that we need to think about how are we integrating these. That's the area right now that's been uptaken, but how can we integrate these? And Hugh, I would love to hear from you about your thoughts about that, because I know that we've been talking back and forth about, should we advocate content into English language arts, or shouldn't we just be advocating literacy into other content areas?
Yeah. So the point you make about the kind of two components, knowledge and the literacy instruction going together, is a good one, because my arguments are not throwing reading comprehension instruction out in this kind of broader view of comprehension. It's recognizing that comprehension is very specific to a topic, and that those topics have to do with knowledge of the world, or narratives, for narrative texts as well. And so we could just teach kids a lot of knowledge. We could just start off, just with social studies, science, so forth, and rely on that to improve comprehension. But I think what's unique about this thinking is it's not a science or social studies curriculum per se. It's a melding together the knowledge instruction with how to help kids get that information out of text, right, or out of lectures, because lectures play a much more important role as kids go through school. And that's the literacy instruction associated with comprehension. We focused for many years on that component and not on the knowledge component. Now, Sonia raises the idea, where do we do this? Well, right now, most of the programs are done within ELA, All right, but it's particularly true at the younger ages. It's the same teacher that might teach the social studies or science. So we could, in fact, put in reading instruction, writing instruction, right? What we've commonly thought of under the rubric of reading and writing within the curriculum to ensure that we're not only teaching the body of knowledge, but we're also teaching kids how to extract that information from text and how to write about it in their own products that they might produce. This is something that's moving along. I mean, we'll see where it's going to go, but I like to think that we can broaden this out a bit, and particularly in the early grades where we've got the same teacher, and we can assure that both reading instruction, writing instruction, and content are not left out in the curriculum, wherever they might be.
I totally agree. And we know that the amount of time spent on science and social studies is pretty negligible. So thinking more fluidly about that, and also thinking about how that knowledge builds coherently across subjects within the year and over time, I think is also just part of the picture.
Yeah, well, that's what Jimmy Kim did in his study. That's what's unique about his study, is that he worked within a science knowledge base, and he taught kids a schema that once they learned that, they were better able to learn knowledge within a related topic that fit that particular schema. Because Jimmy started off wanting to teach literacy, and what he evolved into is, how do you best teach knowledge within the context of reading text and writing? So,
I love that. And, I think too, the way when we think about schema, there's lots of different literature out there, some of it almost being discussed in a way that's really content agnostic. So when I think about his work with the more curriculum, and when I think about our core, it's like, our youngest zoologists learn about, physical characteristics of animals in kindergarten. And then, of course, they're going to be applying that and thinking about that in a more sophisticated way when they're looking at endangered animals in first grade and beginning to think about threats. And as they move through the grades, they're beginning to think about animal adaptation. So that the way that builds and builds over time, it gives kids that architecture or that Velcro. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering if you have, Sonia, you look like you have something else that you want to say before we turn our eye to assessment, because that's really been a hot topic in comprehension.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up by saying Jimmy's work in that he's doing on the more curriculum, it's the explicit teaching of schema, broader schema, and then explicitly teaching students something within that schema, a topic within the schema, and then relating it back out, because his goal is to transfer the schema. So he thinks about I like the image that he invokes with it. He likens a schema building to like a tree. So if you think of the tree trunk as what the schema is, and the topics are the branches, and the leaves is what you know about the topic. He talks about how you might know something about football. Let's say team sports is what you're trying to learn about, and you might know something about football, but you might not know anything about cricket. You can take some of your background knowledge in one sport, or baseball, and take some of your background knowledge in one sport to apply it to a new setting where you're learning about other things, because in general, how team sports work is similar across different topics. And I think that explicit approach, I think that's he's hit on something that is showing repeated effects on comprehension in ways I think that other research hasn't. So I think he's onto something really important there. I also often get asked the question, how does content-rich English language arts instruction differ than traditional literacy instruction? And I just want to point out some of the characteristics of that, of content-rich ELA instruction. And it's really around that the planning of units are planned around science and social studies topics versus being planned around only the English language arts standards. In addition, there's the use of conceptually coherent text sets that are ordered to build knowledge, and that these sets drive whether students they're read aloud to students or whether students are reading them. They're driving children's knowledge building of topics. And then the discussion and the writing, both discussion and writing tends to be focused on the knowledge build, not necessarily on particularly ELA standards per se, although all of these ELA curricula are covering all the English language arts standards. And then there's because texts are related and the topics are related, there is a natural relating of the words, and explicitly teaching the relationship among words is an important feature that you see in content-rich English language arts instruction. So before we move forward, I wanted to make sure to point out those differences that are in content-rich ELA instruction for anybody who's wondering about it.
Yeah. And Barbara, before we go to assessment, real quick, I saw one of the things in the chat was Sarah said something about, isn't this thinking all about thinking? Well, we haven't really talked about the thinking part so much as we talked about the knowledge that would be available to the reader or listener. But that knowledge does you very little good unless you think about it, right? And you think about it at a conscious level. We can get something from text at a rather unconscious level, but most of what we include as new knowledge that we build, that we can remember, is due to thinking. One of my favorite quotes is that memory, what is it? Let's see what it is. Memory is the residue of thought. That's Daniel Willingham's quote. That is, if you want to remember something, you have to think about it, right? Now, the problem is that that's deep thinking, and we're not very good at that, right? We're not predisposed to think like that. Keith Stanovich talks about this, and he was a reading researcher for a number of years, but in the middle of his career, he changed to become a cognitive psychologist that focused on rational thought and so forth. And he talks about two ends of a continuum. One end of the continuum calls type 1 thinking, and that's a rather automatic, almost unconscious thinking, seat of the pants type thinking that we do. And the very other end of it, type 2, is a much more rational, much more thoughtful. You consider alternatives and so forth. And it's toward that end of the continuum of thought that needs to be put into reading most of the text, or what kids need to do to complete assignments and so forth. But what Keith points out, and I think it's true, is from an evolutionary point of view, that type of thinking was not chosen as the major way to think, right? Because that's all you can do, right? If you engage in deep thinking, you really can't do much else. And so we have this tendency to want to use this automatic heuristic thinking when we, in reading, have to develop a habit of thinking more deeply about what it is we read. And the thing about that I love is, well, how do we get kids to do this? You can't tell a 10-year-old just think more about what you're reading, right? I mean, they're not know what to think. Well, that's where strategies come in. So the comprehension strategies are, Daniel Willingham talks about them as tricks to get you to think, right? They give you a way to consciously ruminate the material that's in the text, right? And they work okay, but as you become a more skilled reader, the type of what I call controlled thinking you have to do is dependent upon what it is you're reading, right? So if you're reading an argument, you've got to try to understand versus a science text versus social studies, the way you think about it is going to be very dependent upon what it is you're reading and why you're reading that, right? And that's what I think content-rich literacy curricula can do, is impose in the instruction the particular type of controlled thought that would best allow the reader to understand and remember what it is that they're reading, right? So it is a lot about thinking.
I love that. And thanks for responding to that comment from the chat. We have I can't believe our time is waning. We have about 15 or 20 more minutes to talk together. Hugh, I wondered if you could just give us some top level understanding of the issues around assessment. You referenced earlier how we can't expect standardized assessments to necessarily show change from short-term interventions. I know that you have some thinking beyond standardized tests, although we do know that they matter in state accountability systems. Could you just share some advice for us or things we should be thinking about?
Yeah. So if you go back to what Sonia was talking about in the content-rich curricula and what Jimmy Kim's doing and so forth, if you think about what it means to understand, to comprehend, and individual differences in that ability, that's heavily dependent upon the topic that you're reading about. So trying to develop an assessment that's not topic specific is going to require it to be topic general. And what it's going to do is disadvantage individuals who have less knowledge about the world. And so some people refer to these state exams, the national, the NAEP exam, as knowledge tests in disguise. And they are to a certain extent, because there's all sorts of topics in there that some kids have not spent much time thinking about. The other problem with comprehension measures is that comprehension is multidimensional in that there is multiple things that go into comprehension: word reading ability, working memory, language ability, knowledge, so forth. And depending upon how one of those is written into the text as being more important than another, then the measure can result in a different score. And one of the studies I like to talk about is a study by Jan Keenan, and she had 1,000 kids who had taken 4 different tests of reading comprehension, diagnostic tests, right? And she wanted to know how performance on one is related to performance on the others. And so she first of all looked at a simple correlation, bivariate correlation between one versus the others. And if you put all that together, there's 6 different correlations where you got 4 different tests. And the median correlation was 0.53, right? Which is kind of a moderate correlation, given that those are the same, they're supposed to be measuring the same thing. But the real thing that hit me was that she used those measures to identify the bottom 100 kids on each test, that's the 10th percentile, and look to see how many of those kids in the 10th percentile on one test were in the 10th percentile on one of the other tests, so forth. It was only 43%. That if you're in the 10th percentile on one test, you could flip a coin and get a better chance of being in the lower 10th percentile on another, right? That's because those tests measure different things related to comprehension. But what it means is that we shouldn't be using these tests for diagnostic purposes, because it depends upon which test you take as to whether you might be identified as having a comprehension problem.
Right? I think it really speaks to me around the importance of curriculum embedded assessments, where the theme or topic that's being developed is also used to assess those skills, so that it just makes a lot more sense and is more usable for teachers.
Yeah. Let me go real quickly here, because you bring it. That's where I was going to go to. It is you said that state exams are important and so forth. Well, the state of Louisiana took advantage of a pilot program and actually got rid of their state exam in a number of schools, and they're using the curriculum in humanities and social studies as what they measure kids reading and writing about. So the kids are actually being taught a subject matter, and within that subject matter taught how to read and write in that subject matter, and then they're tested to see if they can actually perform in that. So what that tells me is that we should stop measuring reading comprehension with this notion of a test, and measure it by how well the child how much progress the child has made in reading and writing within the subject matter that's being taught within the classroom. So you measure the child's understanding of a text at the beginning of the semester, and at the end of the semester, you have another opportunity to test them in that same area. And you're likely to make progress there because they're going to learn knowledge. But hopefully, you've taught them something about literacy that will allow them to multiply that knowledge that they have, because now they know how to go about extracting information from text. And I'll stop.
Well, that triggered a question, and I know we're not going to get to all of the questions today. We'll try. We're certainly going to get to a few of them. Is if we're thinking about that for the classroom teacher, what about intervention and interventionists, and how should they be thinking perhaps about assessment? Saw an interesting comment earlier too about making sure we're not constantly pulling out students who need tier 2 and tier 3 interventions out of content-rich learning, be it social studies or be it core language arts, where the grade level texts are really being used. So, do you want to just give us some cliff notes, or just give us enough to be able to think about this?
I think one of the difficulties in general that when I talk with school district leaders, there's so much focus on those third grade reading comprehension scores. And thinking about what Hugh just said about the comprehension test needing to actually measure topics the student has studied as being very important, I think we need to, in general, rethink the emphasis we're placing on that third grade reading comprehension outcome. And I know a lot of those pressures come from above from state, from national. They're not necessarily, at the district level. But I think our society has placed so much effort and so much emphasis on third grade reading comprehension. So I think rethinking what does it mean to have appropriate third grade literacy skills, and how do we measure that? But in terms of the classroom, the point that you made about intervening and providing support for children in tier 2 or tier 3 settings, unfortunately, it does often come at the expense of tier 1. So one thing that might happen is that students are removed from the classroom to have additional phonics instruction, which they might need very badly. However, thinking about when can you provide that instruction is extremely important, because it should not be at the expense of content or of learning other aspects that'll help them to grow. I think sometimes in schools we in our society we have the notion that content, especially for young children in K2, is optional or is special times that can sometimes occur and sometimes not occur. But in thinking about the central role of content to comprehension, we need to really rethink what is a student missing in order to have this additional instruction.
Let me hit that. I thought you were going in one direction, Sonia, but that was mostly thinking about the intervention related to fundamental reading skills. But if we think about kids that have rather specific comprehension problems, I mean they're fine with their word reading and word reading fluency, is that the materials that you would work on are the same materials that are being taught in tier 1. It's that same book. It's those same strategies that are being taught, but it's much more explicit, much more systematic, much more supportive to help kids that struggle to understand the content and how you get to that content with thinking these strategies, right? And helping the child do better there. Now, Sonia also made this thing about third grade reading tests. I mean, I wrote a paper on they're just not fair. Teachers are put at a disadvantage because they don't know what's going to be on that test. But if you told the teacher that in third grade, and you'd have to teach it across the 3 years, that there's going to be a science test at the end that kids need to perform well on, and the kids that understand how you use your literacy skills to do that are going to do better, then we would get instruction that's in a content-rich um, literacy program, and we're more likely to see change because it's directed at something that's malleable, that can be changed. Kids can learn more about whatever it might be.
That feels like a mic drop moment there. The way that assessment sometimes drives those instructional behaviors, and what's really going to help us get those outcomes, in the long run. We have just a few minutes, and I do wonder if we want to take a moment to talk about reading to learn and learning to read. Sonia, would you take that one?
Yeah, and I also want to address a comment that Sarah just made in the chat. Thank you, Sarah, about is the pendulum swinging too far in the content-rich direction and losing sight of what it means to be able to read about something you're unfamiliar with. I want to talk about that in the same conversation, because I agree that students need to be able to learn to read and read to learn. However, they can be doing both right from the beginning. The statement that the learning to read and reading to learn were what was coined by Jean Chall from Harvard University, and she wasn't talking about intervention or instruction. She was talking about development. And so, but when we think about instruction, children can be learning or reading or listening to learn right from the beginning. And so that if that doesn't happen in terms of rich oral language interactions right from the beginning, and if students aren't listening to read alouds of topics and learning about topics right from the beginning, it's going to be too late by the time they're in third grade and third or fourth grade and are falling behind, and now need to read texts primarily to learn from them. I think that it's important to. I think that our intention is not to pendulum swing in an opposite direction into the content-rich direction, but rather provide an idea, more of an understanding of what comprehension entails, that we're not weighting too heavily the comprehension, the one comprehension assessment without looking at other literacy assessments. I don't think anybody is saying that that students shouldn't be able to read a new passage and learn something from it, but they'll be able to learn something from a passage that they have some familiarity with, and they'll be able to take away more information from that passage. But Hugh, do you want to speak to that?
I saw another comment on here. I mean, what do we do about students that don't know very much about a topic? Then the onus is somewhat on the teacher to provide more information about that particular topic and try to perhaps show how that might be related to something that they know about, and over time build the knowledge there. Now that's where some of the strategies might play a bigger role, because kids might need to have something like, well, what is all this about, right? Or you get to the end and give me your best summary of what you just learned. That'll help the teacher figure out what it was that they knew about the topic and so forth. So it's not something that, oh, we're out of, I mean, this isn't going to work, because you have to know something to know it, right? But that knowledge is built over time.
Final point here before we give you each a last word or a statement. There's some conversation here about multilingual learners and how this all applies to them. Can you I think knowledge is for everyone, but what does that look like?
I like Yana Echeverria's comment that she wrote in the chat about language development should come from ELA texts and not something unrelated to the core for multilingual learners. And so that's important. That same principle that we were talking about for students with difficulties, students who are multilingual learners are not students necessarily who have difficulties. In fact, they bring some strengths to the table that can be leveraged. But the instruction that they would need isn't something that's entirely unrelated to their ELA instruction, but should be coming from and deepening that ELA instruction. Oftentimes, picture supports for vocabulary become important, cognate, thinking about cognates and building bridges between students' language and between English becomes important, because students might understand certain concepts and ideas and words in their native language, but not in English.
Yeah. Thank you so much for just providing some big ideas there around this. As we wrap, I'm asking each of you, I know it's hard because of the body of work you have, based on you're seeing the chat, we've had a rich discussion here. What's one-liner piece of advice you want to leave for this group of school administrators, assessment coordinators, curriculum coordinators, reading specialists? One piece of advice. Hugh?
I mean, mine, the title is perfect, Rethinking Reading Comprehension. So rethink the conceptualization that you might have, and reading I try to do the best I can to read these chats, but I'm really impressed. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about this topic, and there's a lot of, oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've been doing this, so forth. It's interesting, as somebody who's been in the field for a long time, we tend to have blinders, and we look at the world in a particular way with what's real popular at that moment. And what we particularly need to do about comprehension is expand our possible thinking about how do you teach it and how do you measure it. And I think that would move us in a direction that kids would be good for kids, teachers, school administrators, everybody.
Sonia?
And I would add to that even though this is very hot topic right now, contemporary, is that the right word?
Right now.
Right now, that knowledge, the importance of knowledge to reading has been studied and understood for decades and decades and decades, very old. The idea that knowledge is important to reading is something that people have been studying for a long time. So what I'd like to leave people with is the idea that, what does knowledge building do for the child in the classroom in order to help them learn literacy skills? And I would say that there are two things that I think about in terms of how knowledge can help children. And one is through the motivation that it provides in learning.
Yeah, good.
And the second one is through the differences that happen in the language learning environment and in the conversations and discussions, and the words that are spoken, what students are saying, all of those features I would think about, what students are writing about, all of those features I would think about in terms of how does knowledge help the children in the classroom. And I encourage people to start thinking about looking at how that might be happening in their classrooms.
Hugh and Sonia, thank you so much. And everybody here who took time out of their day, thank you for joining us. Clearly, we've just scratched the surface. But I hope that you're leaving with lots and lots of questions that you're curious about, and with an expanded view as you look at what's happening in your school and district. I think one of the things that I am pleading for and trying to pledge in my own work as I listen to this is instructional coherence and system coherence. Things in our chat, as we've talked a lot about how things can get very fragmented, and at the end of the day, that doesn't serve the students or their teachers well either. So lots to think about. You'll be receiving an email within a few days with the recording, some resources. When we post the recording on YouTube, we'll put all of the links from the chat so that you can access them. We hope that you turn around and chew on this information with other colleagues in your network, and that you join us in October, where we'll be hearing from district leaders, and that'll be facilitated by Irvin Scott of Harvard. Thank you all.